Hello, everybody. My name's Jeremy Agnew, host of the Grimdark History podcast, where we explore the intersection between history and popular fiction. This is a bonus episode. Normally, this is a show that's released monthly, but I couldn't quite fit everything I wanted to into my last episode, and I had already recorded all of it anyways, and I really had my heart set on starting 2025 with a brand new season. So rather than save all this content and release it January 1, I thought I'd release a little bonus episode in the middle of the month, and we will wrap up season 1 of Grimdark History this episode. We will wrap up the Crisis of the Third Century this episode. We'll just have a quick year in review at the end of it, or kind of season 1 review, and then provide a preview of what is going to be coming up in season 2 of the Grimdark History. So without further ado, we're going to jump right into the episode. I hope everybody enjoys it, and please stay tuned at the end of the episode for a preview of what's happening in season 2. But with Aurelian out of the way and dead, we want to get towards Diocletian, the Christian Purges, and of course we want to talk about our main character, St. George. But of course, everything we've been talking about this episode, St. George would have lived through in some way or another. By now, St. George is a young man, possibly already in the army or about to join the army as a legionary and to become a Roman cavalryman. Aurelian had no clear heir, and a succession of emperors fight tooth and nail, each lasting only a few months on average, as different factions vie for control of this recently reconstituted empire. The most significant of these post-Aurelian emperors is an emperor by the name of Probus. He manages to last 1 year longer on the job than Aurelian did, so he lives 6 years as emperor instead of 5. We don't know too much about him, but we know a few things. We can say it was clear that he was still fighting battles on multiple fronts against Germanic tribes in the Rhine and Danube regions, so Germany, Bulgaria, Ukraine areas. Probus was very successful in some of these conquests. Supposedly 8 different kings submit to him. Probus also committed to rebuilding approximately 60 towns or cities in Gaul that had been ravaged in the previous 30 years. So just 60 towns and cities had been completely ravaged over the last 30 years in Gaul, to give you an idea of the state of Gaul. We also know that Probus took to the ancient Roman tradition of attempting to quote-unquote civilize some of these rival tribes by settling them on the Rhine and Danube borders and then getting them to live in the, how they would say it, quote, Roman way. Supposedly the Vandals, the Bastarni, the Gepids, and the Gruthingi all become part of Rome via Probus's attempts to civilize them. Probus attempted the same tactic with the Franks, but they soon returned to their ancient traditions and went back to raiding Roman lands along Greece and Sicily and along North Africa. They had a merry romp around the Mediterranean, raiding cities and port locations and communities basically all along Greece, Sicily, along North Africa, before wrapping around Spain and going back up the Rhine and home. Banditry was on the rise, especially amongst, Gaul. We'll get to that briefly in a moment. And there was yet another revolt in Egypt to be put down. Probus gets assassinated on his way to attack Persia, just like Aurelian was in one of those alternate reality stories that I talked about. There are 3 successive emperors that follow Probus in the 3 years, and the last of which of these guys dies on campaign against the Persians, leaving the army yet again in the middle of a war to declare a new officer as the general, a new officer as the emperor. And they name a man by the name of Gaius Aurelius Valerius Diocletianus as the new emperor. We know Gaius by the name Diocletian, and we are in 284. It's unclear if Diocletian was at all involved in the assassination of the previous emperor. That's a guy by the name of Numerianus. Diocletian's early life is obscure. He's another nobody who benefited from the reforms of Gallienus. Diocletian was born into a low-class family, just like Aurelian was, likely somewhere in Dalmatia, which is a province along the Adriatic coast of the Mediterranean. Diocletian's path to sole emperor was not a lock, though. Every time an emperor dies, somebody else rises up. And at this time, there is still a second emperor in the west, a guy by the name of Carausius. And just like Diocletian, there is legions declare another officer in another area of Rome as their emperor. This is a guy by the name of Julianus who has legions in northern Italy. The Carausius and Julianus situation, it's good for Diocletian, though. Diocletian's all the way in the east, right around Cappadocia, Turkey, and Thrace. That's where he is. And the legitimate emperor, a guy by the name of Carausius, and the usurper Julianus, they're in close proximity to each other, so they have to fight it out. Carausius has a reputation amongst the population of excessive cruelty and excessive taxation, and Julianus has the stigma of usurper attached to him, which lets Diocletian just sit back, let the two fight it out, and then he can step in and take out whoever the weakened victor is, and he'd have an upper moral hand in either scenario. If Carausius had won the day, Diocletian could paint himself as the freer of the people from the oppression of a cruel and unjust emperor. If Julianus wins, he can claim to be putting down a usurper to the throne, the guy who assassinates and kills a legitimate emperor, and so somebody had to go put this guy down. Might as well be me. Either way, Diocletian was in position to come out on top, and in the end, Carausius defeats Julianus, and Diocletian gets to, quote-unquote, free the people from the cruel emperor. And it's widely suspected by modern scholars that even though the initial engagements between Carausius and Diocletian have Diocletian getting the bad end of those battles, the wind still seemed to be blowing in Diocletian's favor, and a certain officer named Aristobulus under the emperor Carausius may have been the one to assassinate Carausius on behalf of Diocletian, and they think that because shortly after the ascension of Diocletian, Aristobulus gets confirmed to head of the Praetorians, then consul, then proconsul of Africa, and then later Praefectus Urbi. This is an extremely fortunate run for a senior officer of a rival emperor. And if you're wondering what's Praefectus Urbi, I had to look that up myself to figure out what that is. But you can think of the Praefectus Urbi as a combination of mayor, attorney general, Supreme Court, and chief of police. And his area of control is the city of Rome and the immediate kind of 100-kilometer countryside surrounding Rome and the extremely critical ports of Ostia and Portus. So he has control of the local police forces, and he has absolute authority over the city of Rome. Of course, the emperor can overrule that. And he also can arrest, accuse, and try anybody within his area. And at a certain point in time, nobody can appeal the decision of the Praefectus Urbi. So literally, judge, jury, executioner, and the police that arrest you, all wrapped up into the power of one man. So Aristobulus has an extremely fortunate run under Diocletian. Now, Diocletian has no heirs, and he's moreover more of a soldier than an administrator. Keenly aware, though, of the struggles of the last 50 years, he has to make some tough decisions. He can choose to try and consolidate power and concentrate it into the office of emperor, as Aurelian had done just 11 years earlier, or he could look to the examples set by Balbinus and Pupienus in 238, who were co-emperors. The example expanded upon by Aemilianus in the 250s, who set a division of responsibilities between East and West, who then later expanded upon it again by Valerian in the mid to late 250s, seeing the advantages that the East was able to successfully hold off the Persians under their own as a breakaway states by Odenathus and Zenobia. So an idea that's been mulling around, simmering over these last 50 years, that's coming to solidify itself into something of a political state that's successful. Joint rule had also been established for a time and been successful even back pre-crisis. The Emperor Mark Aurelius shared joint rule with Lucius Verus, and then with his son Commodus. The Severan dynasty established the precedence and practice of calling out an heir and signifying an order to establish the transfer of absolute powers between generations. They had a seniority by designating heirs as Augustus and Caesar. All of these precedents had been set with varying degrees of success. What was needed was to pull all these things together in a way that could survive his rule and ensure a stable and smooth transition of power between emperors. Diocletian's first major move was to appoint a fellow soldier, another nobody. This guy's name is Marcus Aurelius Maximianus. This guy is appointed Caesar around 285 and then later elevated to Augustus, which would make him co-emperor. That's in 286. Some people are saying this was inevitable, it was always planned. Other historians say that the elevation to Augustus might never have happened if not for the rebellion of Carausius, who controlled Britannia and the North Sea Fleet and several major strategic settlements in the northern Gaul area. And it's also suggested by some historians that Maximianus just elevated himself to Augustus while he was in Gaul dealing with the situation, thus putting Diocletian in the delicate position of either accepting the situation that, okay, I now have a co-emperor and I didn't really have anything to do with it, could act like this was his plan all along, or he could come out and say, well, Maximianus, that's treason, declaring yourself Augustus without my say-so, and we could plunge the empire into yet another civil war and fracture it asunder. A delicate situation that may have played out publicly very different than how it played out internally. Regardless of what the reality was, whether it was planned by Diocletian or Maximianus just made himself Augustus, and Diocletian, faced with the possibility of civil war and tearing the empire apart again, came to some agreement with each other, a power-sharing agreement. Regardless of that, Diocletian and Maximianus attempt to solidify the relationship as something stable and voluntary, with Maximianus taking on part of Diocletian's family name, signifying a joining of the families. Diocletian began taking on the nickname of Jovian, that's the head of the Roman pantheon, with Maximianus taking on the nickname of Heraclius, which is the son of Jovian. So that was making a divine father-son relationship, signifying not only are we father and son joined by familial bonds, but also signifying Diocletian as the senior in the relationship, the pater familias, the head of the family. So the two of them are figuring out what it means to be emperor together. By 289, though, the west of the empire is not in a good state. The ravages of the last 50 years have left a painful psychic and social scar on Gaul. It has transformed the society into something that is a mix of Romans that have lived there for generations, recently settled Germanic tribesmen that are attempting to readapt to a new social hierarchy and lifestyle. We have additional and constant raiders from the Germanic borders, and there are legionary deserters who couldn't manage the last decade of constant internal and external warfare. And there are mixtures of peasant revolts, mercenary forces creating little mini states within Gaul, and of course the continued and perpetual raiding that's going on the borders that have been happening. And then, of course, that Carausius fellow that I mentioned, or Carausius fellow that I mentioned just a moment ago, but I'll get back to him in just a moment. One of the defining moments in history that won't yet be really felt for a couple hundred years, Maximianus, who is in Gaul dealing with the situation there, received the submission of the king of the Franks and managed to settle them down and several other tribes inside Gaul with the obligations to protect the lands that they have settled. setting up, of course, the eventual ascension of the Frankish kings in a few hundred years. Of particular concern to Maximianus, though, is the Bagadi or Bagadi. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce that. They appear to be a mixture of this various peoples that I just talked about, the Roman peasants that are starving and have no security, the recently semi-settled Germanic tribesmen trying to figure out how to integrate in society, and some being more successful than others, Germanic raiders from the borders, and these legionary deserters setting up these kind of little mini-states. They're all lumped in together as one name, this Bagadi. Maximianus is occupied with dealing with them and is mostly dealing with a man they call Amandus, who's coming to some prominence as the head of one of these little Bagadi mini-states. And by the late 280s, Maximianus is also dealing with some Frankish and Saxon coastal pirates that have begun attacking Britannia and northern Gaul. And this causes the governor of Gaul, a man by the name of Carausius, to briefly claim a Britannic / Roman Empire, and he declares himself emperor in the north and attempts, quote unquote, to say that this is like Maximianus and Diocletian. This is where some of the theory that maybe Maximianus declared himself Augustus and Diocletian just had to accept it, because Carausius begins minting coins that shows himself and Maximianus flanking Diocletian as the senior emperor, trying to indicate, hey, we're all emperors together. Diocletian, I'm acknowledging you to be the senior emperor, but me and Maximian, we're emperors on our own. There may have been some of that going on. So Maximianus is trying to deal with the breakaway Britannia, these brigands, the Bagadi, as well as ongoing Germanic raiders, so he's got his hands full. Diocletian is also not idle in the east. He's fighting and defeating Sarmatians, that's a nomadic horse archer people on the Danube, and then he also successfully secures a peace treaty with the Persian kings. And around 288, the east is reasonably stable, and he joins Maximianus in the west in his wars against the Germanic tribes, primarily the Alemanni, continuing Aurelian's scorched earth policies in an attempt to starve the peoples into submission. It achieves some success, though, because by the 290s, the empire is more or less stabilized, with only the breakaway Carausius holding Britannia and the North Seas and some strategic northern Gaulish settlements and legions under his sway. And in 291, both these emperors hold a joint conference. It's away from Rome. It's near the critically strategic city of Milan in northern Italy, and the senators of Rome are forced to leave Rome and travel to meet the emperors and pay homage and, that sort of thing. The emperors meet for the first time in a few years and kind of shore up their relationship, and they profess joint unity of the empire together and jointly celebrate their successes. No one person holds victory titles, they jointly hold them. And it is likely during this critical meeting in 291 that both the emperors discuss the need for more delegation to deal with all the challenges of governing such a large empire, and this probably sets up the concept of 4 men ruling, 2 senior emperors and 2 junior emperors. And we get now to the establishment of what's called the Tetrarchy, which is the rule of 4 emperors. As we discussed earlier, Maximianus's elevation to co-emperor or Augustus and the acceptance of that may not have been entirely voluntary by Constantine and may have instead been reflective more on a desire to accept realities and avoid civil war than a competent, forward-thinking plan by Constantine. Nevertheless, by 293, Maximianus declares his son-in-law Constantius as Caesar, and Diocletian quickly names his own candidate, a guy by the name of Galerius, as his Caesar to keep the balance of powers in check. It seems like Diocletian's one step behind Maximianus. But if you are ever in or around or have cause to visit Venice, please make it a point to visit the Piazza San Marco, where you can see a statue commemorating this very moment, showing the 2 co-emperors and the 2 Caesars, each clasping each other in a show of unity. Constantius, that's the Caesar, the junior emperor of Maximianus. Constantius is the father of the future emperor Constantine, by the way, who will be the first emperor to officially convert to Christianity. This early in what is known as the Tetrarchy, though, it doesn't appear that the emperors were officially assigned specific regions or responsibilities. There's no emperor of the East, no emperor of the West. Rather, it seems that every emperor went wherever it was they were needed, and the court and local government followed suit. This would change in later iterations under later emperors, but for now, it's a flexible geographic assignment. There's no east-west emperor. It's just we've got 2 senior emperors, 2 junior emperors, and everybody is where they need to be. And from 293 to 305, all these emperors are in one region or another in a near state of constant war. They're either fighting to put down Carausius and his Britannic breakaway empire, or they're fighting the Germanic and Sarmatian tribes along the Rhine and Danube, or they're fighting against the Persians, or they're fighting against the Arabians. And after 2 or 3 years, the action shifts away from the west towards the eastern provinces. Maximian campaigns in Mauritania, that's modern-day northern Morocco and northern Algeria, so the parts of Africa, North Africa, that are right along the Mediterranean coast. Diocletian is involved in suppressing a revolt in Egypt, and Galerius is attacking Persia. Diocletian's wars in Egypt result in several bloody battles, several sieges across several cities, and it's even rumored that Diocletian would not stop the bloody revenge on Alexandria until the blood flowed up to his horse's knees. But by 299, Egypt is pacified, the Persian campaigns are finally a success, with Rome recovering parts of Mesopotamia and getting a pro-Roman king installed in the critically strategic important region of Armenia. Carausius has been put down, and the quote-unquote eternal light has been returned, as the minted coins in Britannia say. By 303, both Maximian and Diocletian have achieved what no emperor in the previous 100 years had, and that is being able to survive on the throne for more than 10 years. and they each celebrate their 20-year anniversary as emperor. Shortly after this 20-year anniversary, both Maximian and Diocletian retire, elevating Galerius and Constantius to the position of senior emperor in 305. But what about St. George? What about the Christian persecutions that St. George supposedly dies in? I didn't touch on that, did I? Let's talk about these things as we wind down the episode. Let's get into St. George and Christian persecutions right around this time. First, let's start off with what we know about Christian persecutions. And we're going to cover the period between the late 290s to the early 300s. That's when the Christian persecutions under Maximian and Diocletian happened. In the early parts of their reign, Christians were completely tolerated, and if you listen to part 1 in this series where I talked about Christians in the Roman Empire, we talked specifically about the Legion of Thebes that was an entirely Christian legion in 275 that would put the Theban legion right around the era of Aurelian and Tacitus and Florianus, possibly even Probus. There was entirely accepted to have Christians in the legions. That was one of the reforms of Gallienus just a few years earlier. So Christians had been in the army for a few decades. Christian persecution was not a thing. They were accepted. Christians had opportunities to improve their position in Roman society. But in the late 290s, something changes. And if you were listening intensely while I was talking about Diocletian and Maximian and how the armies have moved around, I've been talking about Egypt and the eastern provinces revolting over and over and over again. Well, in the 290s, the late 290s, when Diocletian is in Egypt putting down the revolt, it is widely suspected that a particular sect of Christians popular in the East, they're known as the Manichaeans, were responsible for agitating and inciting the revolts in Egypt and in other eastern provinces. It's also suspected that the Persian king at the time, that's King Shapur, had forbidden persecution against any religious groups, was also supporting and encouraging the Manichaeans within the eastern Roman provinces as a kind of fifth column to stir up revolt and discontent and make it easier for him to then retake those provinces. During the Egyptian revolt, when Diocletian is in Egypt, leading those bloody sieges where he's, waiting for the blood to run up to the knees of his horse before he'll stop. It's during that time, 302, that there is an edict against the Manichaean Christians. What was the exact context of the edict? We don't know. The records of it are lost to time, but we know there was an edict specifically against the Manichaean Christians. We don't know what it was, what they did, how it was enforced. We just know it happened. After the Manichaean persecution, we know attention turned to other Christians within the empire, and of course their general refusal to follow Roman commands. And to give you some example, in 295, a certain Roman citizen by the name of Maximilian was brought before the proconsul of Africa for refusing to enlist in the army. This was a mandatory law instituted by Constantine. It was widely reported that Junior Emperor Galerius removed all Christian officers, or reduced all Christian officers to rank and file legionaries. Others may have entirely purged their ranks of Christians. We also know about a Christian centurion in 298, a guy by the name of Marcellus, who refused to take part in the celebrations of honor of Maximian because they involved sacrifice to the gods. So Diocletian and the other emperors, they had two choices. We could allow Christians an exception to enlistment, or we could try to deter people from being Christian, punish them for being Christian. If they allowed exceptions, then of course they would be worried about sudden faithless conversions. I don't want to be a legionary. I'm happy with my home. I got my wife and kids. I got my family. I got my business. I don't want to have to enroll as a legionary and then be taken all the way across the empire to fight somebody I don't care about and might die. So if you knew that converting to Christianity would exempt you from mandatory duties in the legions, well, you might find Christianity had a sudden explosion of faithful and recent conversions. So in lieu of finding suddenly massive chunks of the empire converting to Christianity just to get out of serving in the army, they opted for option A. There are some apologists for Diocletian who lay the blame of Christian persecutions on Galerius, as by this time Diocletian is getting on in age. He's starting to become ill, and he was possibly deferring to Galerius for the anti-Christian stance. Several edicts took place in 303, the first ordering the destruction of regional churches and burning of Christian communities, and in some cases, burning of Christians. Another edict ordered the arrest and imprisonment of the clergy, and a third edict ordered a compulsory sacrifice to the gods, just like Decius did a couple decades earlier. And failure to do that would result in execution. It's clear, though, that the stance on persecuting Christians was not equally weighed as important by all emperors involved. Maximian, who was in the West as these edicts are coming in to be enforced, he applied those edicts a bit more lightly, closing some churches, confiscating some books, not really executing people, not really arresting many. Constantius, that's his junior Caesar, did even less than Maximian. Although it is important to point out that the West at this time has not nearly as many Christians as the East does. Christian dissidents within the West would be low to almost non-existent. No one in the West was executed for being a Christian. Galerius, on the opposite end of this in the East, had a noted zeal. Especially burning Christian alive seemed to be a favorite punishment of his. In some regions, it was actually recorded that the local leadership reported to the emperors what the emperors wanted to hear, and that is that everybody sacrificed and nobody bothered to check that it was actually happening. And in the East, where Galerius is burning Christians, there turns out to be a kind of, semi-Christian underground railroad type thing where people would attempt to smuggle or hide Christians or protect them, but there were also community-wide pogroms, arrests, and executions. So where does St. George fit in all this? So we talked quite a bit about Aurelian and the state of the empire under Gallienus, who removed Christian persecutions in order to grow the legions by having more Christians to swell the ranks. Aurelian kept on with this policy, and successive emperors, that few group that followed Aurelian, also continued this policy. So we've got a few decades here where Christians are able to improve their life. They can worship openly. They can become part of the army and get advancement under the reforms of Gallienus into important political positions of power. St. George, if he existed at all, and most historians tend to think he did not exist, but that he is rather an amalgamation of kind of hagiography and like storytelling tradition and things like that, I am actually going to defer you to the Rest is History episode. That's a great history podcast, and they actually go in depth into the myth making around St. George and the historicity of his various stories. But if we assume St. George exists, legends tell us he was born somewhere around Cappadocia, so that's modern day Eastern Turkey, and that his mother was a Syrian Roman. He would have grown up potentially as a young man under Diocletian, and one of Diocletian's reforms was mandatory military service. So maybe he was caught up in the mandatory military service, or earlier than that, he may have just become part of one of those people who wanted to be part of the army in order to get advancement. You know, you hear a guy like Aurelian, who is a nobody, coming up from the nothing ranks to become emperor. That must have seemed like a dream to people. So you can see some attraction to becoming a Christian and being in the army. But also, again, Christians didn't like having to kill. So there might be an element of enforced conscription there. Now, the earliest tales of our veneration of St. George as a Christian figure date to the late 4th century, early 5th century. The legend of the dragon dates to the 11th century. And there's lots of different stories about how he was persecuted. In some, he's decapitated in Nicomedia, and others, he's in a region called Diospolis. It's always in the east, though. That's where he's associated with. So in the east, of course, there was Gallienus doing his persecution of the Christians, burning them alive, shutting down cities or communities, arresting people, burning churches, that type of thing. Diocletian was in Egypt, attacking and putting down the revolt there, which was blamed on the Manichaean Christians. And the story of St. George and the Dragon actually takes place in Egypt or North Africa, usually set around, I think, the city of Cyrene, which is in Libya, so the neighboring province to Egypt. So there is precedent for Diocletian and Maximian to both be in Egypt and in North Africa all at the same time. There is definitely Christian persecutions happening in the east, particularly under Gallienus, who was controlling the provinces in the east at the time the edicts happened. So St. George, if he existed in an extreme, the tail end of this crisis of the 3rd century. He didn't survive long enough to make it to Emperor Constantine and the Christianity becoming part of the empire, and the alteration of the oaths of allegiance to allow for Christians to swear oaths of loyalty without going against their faith. He grew up and was part of the armies that fought battles against the Egyptians or against the Arabians or even against the Persians if he was in the officer corps. If he was in the armies of Gallienus, at some point he would have been demoted in the ranks from an officer to a normal kind of straight, here's your shield and your pilum spear. It's rumored that he was executed by beheading, which would have been a standard means of execution of a Roman citizen. If you weren't a Roman citizen, you got the painful execution. You could be crucified, you could be burned alive, you could be forced to fight animals or other prisoners in the Colosseum for people's entertainment, fight to the death. But if you were a Roman citizen, one of the laws gave you a quick death, so execution by beheading. St. George may even have been old enough to have been involved in either the armies of Zenobia and her breakaway Palmyran state, who later surrendered after a couple of battles with Aurelian, or may have been a non-legionary Roman living in Anatolia as Aurelian and his armies marched through and towns were surrendering to him. He may have been drafted into Aurelian's army as he was going through. So St. George, if he existed at all, lived through the tail end of the Reformation of the Roman Empire. He was either involved in the Palmyran breakaway state, if he was a particularly older man. If he was a younger man, he was involved in Diocletian or Galerius's continued attacks against the Persians to regain Mesopotamia and exact revenge for the capture of Emperor Valerian. Or he may have been involved in the putting down of the Manichaean Christian revolt in Egypt, or at least the revolt that ultimately was blamed on the Manichaean Christians. We don't really know if it's true that they were involved. We just know that they end up getting persecuted, and this is what we were told, is that it was because they believed they were part of those groups of people that were continually stirring up revolt against Rome. So he had a complicated life with a lot of action associated with it, spent years in and around the Persian, Mesopotamian, Arabian, and Egyptian areas of Rome. This is the fascinating history that St. George would have lived through and experienced right up until the day he was beheaded. And so I thought we would end our series here on St. George with just a kind of recap of what we covered in the series and, what did we achieve here as a final episode in the season 1 of the Grimdark history, and then look forward to what it is that's happening in the new year. So let's just spend the last few minutes just talking about these couple things. As we wind down the podcast for the end of the year, we're wrapping up, of course, the last episode in season 1. Season 2 of the Grimdark History will start in January. January 1, look for a brand new episode to drop, and I'll be talking about what we're doing, what our broad topic is for Season 2. Of course, Season 1, if you've been following along in the podcast, we have been exploring all the historical times and places and people that the Warhammer 40,000 character, the Emperor of Mankind, has been that we know of in the modern history lore. The lore is one of those things that kind of vague. It's been rewritten a couple of times, but for the last, I think, 10 years or so, Black Library, which is the publishing company that holds the rights to the Warhammer 40,000 fictional universe, they have been going through an effort to solidify some of the ancient history of the Emperor. And over the last few years, some of the books that have come out that have teased out parts of the Emperor's ancient history that are very, very recent, basically a rewriting, reimagining of the ancient lore from like the 1980s. Now they've solidified it and made it something new, a little better. Well, love-hate relationship if you're a fan of the show. I love the latest rewriting. And this is where the podcast came about, was I had originally envisioned it to be just about the Warhammer 40,000 universe and how we can take elements of our own history and apply that to parts of this fictional universe in order to understand context and understand what the reality might be like. There's giant tank battles and trench warfare, and I was thinking of bringing up books that people have written that have firsthand diary accounts of people from World War I who lived through trench warfare or World War II, that sort of thing. So I started the podcast initially with that kind of idea, and as I did the first couple of episodes on the very first ancient history of this character, the Emperor of Mankind, we went all the way back, way into prehistory. We went deep into what's known as the Copper Age and start of the Bronze Age. And as I was starting the podcast, of course, very much an amateur fan of history, all my research for those first few episodes heavily involved sources I could find and pull together and verify in multiple ways across the internet. A lot of it wasn't true, some of it was, and so it involved a lot of validating information I was getting as I was putting the podcast together. But as I went through those first few episodes on the what was life like in the Copper Age, as we went forward and kind of went through a Sherlock Holmes type thing in episode 3 in that series, we looked at how we could put an actual date and time to the birth date of this figure, the Emperor of Mankind. We used religion that he talked about, the languages that we know that are referenced in the book. We used material culture that was talked about and referred to. These are all, technology, culture, and these leave the mark on history. And using these things, we can do detective work to deduce when he was born. Other references about where geographic features were, which were actual real geographic features. The Sakarya River in Turkey is mentioned. We can use some of these pieces of information to infer where in Turkey it was likely he was born, based on information he talks about, versus traders that come during particular times of day. You can do some math on how far people can travel by boat or by horse or by walking, with carts, that type of thing. And so we did this little Sherlock Holmes who, what, where, when, and why type thing in episode 3 of this series, when we kind of locked down the birthplace and the birth time of the Emperor of Mankind, and definitively placed him much earlier than how people think he is, in the 1980s lore. In the next part of the series, we went forward about 1,000 years or so into the Bronze Age, and we were talking about the destruction of the Tower of Babylon, because we know that is one of the events that the Emperor of Mankind is involved in. He's one of the army, he's leading the army that does this. And so, as I was exploring that, I was pulling in some more interesting sources about the Bronze Age, referring to research I was able to pull from actual Bronze Age historian professors, ones that, explored Bronze Age Minoans, Bronze Age Babylonians, Mesopotamians, Assyrians. I was able to find and pull articles and archaeological papers that were written in order to get information about materials that were mentioned in the books and whether or not these things were used, technology that was put together. And we broadly discussed, 1,600 years of history of Babylon. We talked about the culture of Babylon, the religion of Babylon, free women within Babylon, which is kind of a fascinating thing that I learned about. I thought it was one of the most fascinating parts of history that I've learned so far, was learning about the free women in Babylon and the culture of Mesopotamia. And then again, in the last episode in that series, we talked about all the times through history Babylon had been attacked and when the tower might have been sacked or destroyed. And we did another episode that was very much a Sherlock Holmes thing, where we looked at the actual text in the Warhammer 40,000 books that mention the event. It talks about, types of armor that people were wearing, types of technology that was used in the building of the tower, materials, marble, ebony, alabaster, glass, the scale mail armor. These are things that it's technology that have set dates available to them. And so, we can do another little Sherlock Holmes type thing and try and cross-reference the technology. When is the technology available? And does the availability of this technology line up with any events in our own history where someone actually destroyed or at least successfully sacked the city of Babylon and its tower, the temple? Invading armies didn't always do that. You don't want to invoke the wrath of the gods, even if it was an enemy army. So oftentimes the temple would get left alone. But using this comparison, we were actually able to pin the Emperor of Mankind to the Assyrian king Sennacherib, who is an honest-to-goodness, actual historical figure. He was an Assyrian king, and he 100% leveled the city of Babylon, specifically mentions raiding and destroying the Tower of Babylon. And so we talked about the story of Sennacherib and how we can tie those things together with the technology that was mentioned. And we went over the history of Sennacherib and what he did to Babylon, because he wrote down what he did to Babylon. And then we figured out what the Tower of Babylon actually looks like. We looked at a few fictional accounts describing the Tower of Babylon. Then we looked at historical accounts describing the Tower of Babylon. And then we looked at an actual honest-to-goodness Assyrian or Babylonian tablet that was found that actually described what the Tower of Babylon looked like and compared everything together. So that was also pretty interesting and fascinating. In the next episode in the series, we went forward a few hundred years into the time of Alexander the Great. And what was interesting about this is one of the first times that we have a lot of detail about a historical figure. And also, there has been a lot of popular culture about Alexander the Great. Multiple TV series, multiple fictional books, multiple movies. So I thought rather than just focus on the Warhammer 40,000 fictional character, we would broadly look at the entire history of Alexander the Great instead of this one event. Let's look at the career and life of Alexander and the time. And so that ended up being the longest series I've done so far. I think it was 5 episodes. But in those episodes, I was able to pull in probably 2 major sources. I had this is when I started doing, getting books where I could read and pull and compare things together. So I think I had about 5 or 6 different sources, main sources for that. And that also in turn involved a lot of other research to just kind of answer some questions. But I was able to compare 2 main accounts of Alexander the Great, one by a guy by the name of Aurelian and another one by a guy by the name of Plutarch. And we were able to compare both of what they did versus the actual life of Alexander the Great. And then we were able to wrap some things together, and we discussed Alexander's career, some of the major events, what he felt about religion, what he felt about slavery, how he felt about Persians, how Persians felt about Alexander. We were able to pull a lot of interesting pieces of information together into that series, and because there was so much written about Alexander, I was able to go into a lot of detail. So that is a fascinating series. If you're at all interested about the life and time of Alexander the Great, I would recommend you go back and listen to that series, because there's probably a lot in there that you don't realize about Alexander the Great that I was able to tease out. Next up, we looked at the First Jewish-Roman War, because we know, at least in the fictional universe of Warhammer 40,000, the Emperor was the figure of Jesus. And so while I was doing initial research into, the time and place of Jesus, the Bible, of course, is a fantastic resource if you want to know about the life and time of Jesus. But I wanted to tell something that a lot of my listeners probably didn't know about. And while I was doing some research and defining, what are the historical records near that time that we have, or do we have anything, I came across a Roman Jewish historian, a guy by the name of Flavius Josephus, who'd written several books about his life and what time period known as the First Jewish-Roman War. And Flavius Josephus lived just 30 years after Jesus dies, so he was born right around the year Jesus would have been crucified. And 30 years after that is when the First Jewish-Roman War breaks out, and that's the time when Rome destroys the city of Jerusalem. And Flavius Josephus didn't just write about that. He was actually involved in the First Jewish-Roman War. He was a priest in Jerusalem. He was a general for the Jewish armies during the revolt. He's eventually captured by future Roman Emperor Vespasian and is enslaved by him. And he is with Vespasian's son Titus as Titus sieges and destroys Jerusalem. And Josephus writes down his accounts. So this is first-hand accounts of what it's like being in cities as Rome is sieging and destroying them. And so I was fascinated, kind of morbidly fascinated that we had a first-hand account of such a major component of history. And so I thought I'd twist the podcast a little bit, and we, instead of focusing on Jesus, we would focus on this First Jewish-Roman War, because I had literal first-hand accounts in front of me and I couldn't walk away from that. But it was interesting because it turns out, as I was looking into that, the things that happen in the time of Jesus are also well documented, and those lead up. There's some of the causes that are happening there are some of the things that set off that First Jewish-Roman War. And as I was trying to understand that, I kept kind of going back and, where did Jesus come from? Where did his thinking come from? Where did John the Baptist's thinking come from? How do we keep going backwards in time? We had Herod the Great. How did he get in charge? All those things kept going backwards in time. It was like a domino. I'd pick up one domino, there's another one behind it. I had to keep going backwards, and it turns out you've got to go back about 200 years in the history of Jerusalem to understand the start of events that lead up to the time of Jesus and the first Jewish-Roman War that happens about 30 years later. And so we went through the history of what's known as the Hasmonean dynasty. That's the dynasty of kings that eventually start the revolt against the Seleucid Empire and solidify Jerusalem as an independent kingdom, raise it up into kind of a great and powerful city-state, and they're the ones that are eventually deposed by Pompey the Great and Herod the Great, who becomes the new line of kings. And so I went through all of that, and it was a fascinating, exciting period of time because the Hasmonean dynasties, it's like the Game of Thrones, if you believe it or not. And we have, again, historical records written that happened just at that time. So we were able to pull all that together too. So if you're at all interested about a super fascinating period of time known as the Second Temple period, you can look up my history of the First Jewish-Roman War, and that starts off with the episode titled The Identity Politics in the Hasmonean Court, followed by the Hasmonean Dynasty's Game of Thrones. Then Messiah's Romans Fires Oh My, which is the episode that talks about the very outbreak of the First Jewish-Roman War and the time period of Jesus of Nazareth and other messiahs that were happening at that time. And then the final episode in that series is called The First Jewish-Roman War, where we look at the Flavius Josephus's written accounts of the events of the war that he was involved in. And then we got to this series now, which is the last historical figure we knew the Emperor of Mankind to be, and that is St. George. And so as I was doing my initial research into St. George, of course, he's a Christian, so that's a critical part of understanding the life and time of St. George. And it's also a period of time known as the crisis of the 3rd century, and I was fascinated as I started digging into that. First, I was trying to figure out, okay, what do we have about sources from the 3rd century? Do we have any information about Cappadocia, where he was born, what it was like during this time? I reached out to a couple of different Roman ancient history professors at the university level in a couple of different universities to get their inputs on what sources I could read to help me understand this time period. And I also thought I really needed to understand what was Romans' view on Christianity, because of course the Christian purges of Diocletian, this episode, were an important part of the story of St. George. And so I really wanted to understand Romans' perception of Christianity and, was it always persecution? Was it not? What did Romans think about Christians? What did Christians think about Romans? And so that got me digging into what are the first non-Christian accounts of Christians? That's when I discovered Pliny the Younger, his complete works, his letter to the Emperor Trajan. It is the very earliest Roman account, non-biblical account of Christians ever written. And so I thought I had to start there. And from there, I went and looked for other early accounts of Christians. So we looked at a few different ones in order to understand them all. And then from there, we looked at the build up to the crisis of the 3rd century. What happened, what sets the stage for St. George's lifetime, because it's an absolute insane period of time. So we had that episode, The Crisis of the Third Century, and then we had to put Rome back together because that is the time of St. George. And of course, if you're listening in the last episode, I had a discussion on the Reddit forums of ancient Rome about the Emperor of Aurelian, and a lot of people were great fans. And I happened to run into somebody who not only was a fan of Aurelian, but was a fan of the Grimdark History podcast. So I wanted to say thank you in the best way I knew how, and that was to make sure I spent a little extra time on Aurelian and giving his due to my fan of the show who also loved Emperor Aurelian. So that episode went a little longer than had initially been planned, but that's the way it is. And so I had all this content left over, not quite enough for its own episode, so I thought I'd release it as a bonus episode where we just talked about Christianity, Diocletian, the Tetrarchy, and now this, the wrap up to season 1 of the Grimdark History podcast. Season 2 of the Grimdark History podcast, starting in January in 2025, will be covering the popular fictional universe of Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles. We had a voting poll for fans of the show, and that ran, I think, for about 3, maybe 4 months to let people vote on a few different potential topics that I put up. And so I put the poll up, I think, about 3 different forums I'm involved in, as well as some of my social medias I was on. And I compiled all those results together, and fans of the show seem to also be fans of the Vampire Chronicles. So that's what's won out, and research is already done. And episode 1, as of the time of recording of this, is already in kind of early editing process. We're going to be talking about the real history of the times that are written about in Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles. So we'll be looking at, early 1900s, late 1800s New Orleans. We'll be looking at post-World War II France. We'll be looking at, I think, Renaissance-era Rome. I think that's roughly around the time of Armand. We'll be looking at the mid-1700s France. That's where the vampire Lestat was born, so that's just pre-revolution. We'll be looking at, I believe, ancient Egypt, which I believe is where Akasha is from, or at least that's where it's set in. I haven't gotten that far into my research schedule yet, but we are going to be covering all the ancient history of these vampires. So that'll be what season 2 is going to be covering. I've already just reading about the history of New Orleans right around the 1900s. It's absolutely insane, all the stuff that went on. So I'm super excited for that, and I hope you are excited for that too, as we get into some brand new fascinating history, the real history of pop fiction. And that is where season 2 of the Grimdark History is going to be. And I hope to see you in just a short time when the first episode in that series drops. As always, I am Jeremy Agnew. I am the host of the Grimdark History podcast. And this podcast is not possible without you, the listeners. I want to thank everybody so much. Those that have messaged me on forums I've been involved in, a couple of people I've met in person that recognized my voice, and to tell me that they enjoyed the podcast. If you want to reach out to me, I'm always available by email, by reaching out to grimdarkhistory@gmail.com. I am also on YouTube. You can just go to YouTube and look for Grimdark History, or just go at Grimdark History. If you're on the YouTube channel, it'll take you right to my page. I'm also on Instagram at GrimdarkPod. I'm just learning how to try and get that involved a little bit more in the podcast. So thank you very much. This has been a fun a couple of years, well, year and a half to go through season 1, and we'll see how long it takes us to go through season 2, but it takes as long as it takes. I'm intent to give it the same treatment and detail that I've done for season 1. So I will see everybody in the new year. Thank you very much for supporting and enjoying the show, and have a great new year.